Montana Territory, 1871. The wind howled low through the cottonwoods along the banks of the Yellowstone River as a lone rider slowed his horse beside a broken-down wagon, half covered in snow and shadow. The woman sitting beside it looked half frozen and barely alive. She wore a tattered gray dress that had once been blue, boots with the soles torn thin, and a shawl wrapped so tightly around her shoulders it seemed stitched to her bones. Her hands were raw, her face wind-burned, and her eyes stared into the dirt like they were trying to disappear into it. The cowboy reined in, dismounted, and stepped closer, boots crunching in the frozen mud. "You all right, miss?" His voice was low, steady. She looked up, startled. Her cheeks were hollow, but her eyes still had fight in them. "No," she said. He nodded once, like he expected that. "Name's Judson Vale," he said, removing his hat. "I got a fire going not far from here. You come with me, I'll get you warm. Got some jerky and coffee, too." She hesitated. Then her voice cracked. "I cannot leave them." Judson followed her line of sight. Two children, both under 10, huddled in the back of the wagon beneath a threadbare quilt. A boy and a girl. The girl's lips were blue. "Twins?" he asked. She nodded. "Their names are Jonah and Josie." He looked at her again. "Yours?" She blinked slow, as if remembering how to speak. "Keziah Zeller." He offered his hand. "Come on now, Keziah Zeller. Let us move them to the fire. We can talk after they stop shaking." She hesitated a beat longer before placing her hand in his. It was ice cold, thinner than it should be, but she stood steady. Together, they carried the children across the frozen grass to where Judson's campfire cracked beneath a stand of pine trees. He wrapped his saddle blanket around the twins and poured coffee into a tin cup, pressing it into Keziah's hands. She stared into the flames for a long time before speaking. "My husband left 3 weeks ago to find work in Bozeman. Never came back." Judson nodded. "Looks like he is not coming back." "I know," she said quietly without looking up. He watched her. Her dress was ragged, her hair tangled, lips cracked from cold and wind, but her back was straight. She had not begged. "You're just a girl in rags," he said, not unkindly, "but I have always preferred something real." She looked up at him then, sharp. "What is that supposed to mean?" He sat across from her, resting his arms on his knees. "It means I have seen ribbons and perfume and women with soft hands who cannot boil water or hold a crying child. You got dirt under your nails and you still kept those kids alive out there. That is real." Keziah blinked, unsure what to make of him. Josie coughed, whimpering. Keziah reached for her quickly, pressing her close. Judson moved to the fire and pulled out a small tin of salve from his saddlebag, handing it to her. "It will help their skin," he said, "and yours." She took it without a word. The next morning, Judson hitched her wagon to his horse and rode beside it as they made their way east toward his homestead. It was a modest cabin tucked into the base of the hills, with a lean-to for the horse and a root cellar dug deep into the frozen ground. "You live alone?" Keziah asked as they arrived. "Used to be me and my brother," he said. "He passed 2 winters ago, just me now." Keziah helped him unload the wagon, her hands cracked and red. He watched her carry Josie in one arm and a bushel of turnips in the other. "You do not have to do all that," he said. "I do," she replied, simple and firm. He smiled faintly. "All right then." Days passed. The children began to laugh again. Josie drew pictures in the dirt with a stick. Jonah followed Judson around the cabin, asking about nails and saddle straps. Keziah cooked, cleaned, and stitched a new pair of mittens from one of Judson's old shirts. She never asked for anything, never complained. Each night, she sat by the fire while the twins slept and wrapped her hands around a tin cup, quiet. One evening, Judson sat beside her and cleared his throat. "You planning to go back west when the weather clears?" She shook her head. "There is nothing left west," he nodded slowly. "Well then, You and the twins are welcome to stay. She turned to look at him. Why? Because you are real, he said. And I reckon I like having something real around here. Keziah stared at him for a long time. Then her lips parted, and for the first time since he found her, she smiled. It was small, but it lit her face like sunrise over snow. I like being here, she said. So do the children. His hand brushed against hers on the wooden bench. She did not pull away. The wind howled again through the trees that night, but inside the cabin it was warm. Judson brought out a second blanket and draped it over her shoulders. She leaned into it. Thank you, she whispered. He looked at her, his voice rough. You are not alone anymore, Keziah. She turned to him, eyes full. Neither are you. Outside, the snow started falling again. Inside, the fire crackled low, and for the first time in a long while, both of them felt safe. The thaw came slow, that spring, reluctant and stubborn as a mule. Snow still clung in the shadows under the pines, but the river cracked open in places, and birds began to return, cautious in their song. In the lean-to, Judson fixed a split in the roof with fresh-hewn boards while Jonah passed him nails one by one, careful not to drop them. Inside the cabin, Keziah stood at the table with a knife in hand, stripping bark from willow branches. She worked quiet, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, the morning light showing the fine scars on her forearms, old burns, likely from a cook stove. Josie sat beside her, sorting leaves into piles by shape. Judson stepped in, wiping his hands on a cloth. You making something out of that, a basket, Keziah said. For gathering, the roots are coming in late, but they'll come. He leaned against the doorframe. You know your plants. I learned because I had to. Boiling pine needles for fever, crushed mint for bites. There weren't always doctors around. Still aren't, he said. Not out here. She didn't answer, just kept slicing bark into long, smooth ribbons. Her hands moved with quiet certainty. That night the wind dropped and the fire burned low and steady. Judson sat at the table, sharpening the blade of his drawknife. Keziah fed a few embers into the stove and turned, her face flushed from the heat. You ever get lonely out here? She asked, her voice low. He looked up, setting the drawknife down. I used to. It got quieter than a grave some nights, but not lately. She nodded, folding a cloth and setting it beside the basin. I thought I'd gotten used to being alone after he left, but I didn't. I just got good at pretending. You don't have to pretend here, he said. Keziah hesitated, then walked to the window, her arms crossed over her chest. I'm not sure what I am now. I was a wife. Then I was abandoned. Now I'm a guest in a home that isn't mine, depending on a man I hardly knew a month ago. You're not just a guest, Judson said. And you're not depending on anyone, you're holding your own. She turned to face him. You don't find it strange? A woman with nothing, 2 children staying on your land. I find it right, he said. You work hard. The children laugh now. That's enough for me. Keziah looked at him for a long stretch. Then quietly she said, he used to laugh too, before the whiskey. Judson didn't speak. He wasn't always cruel, she went on, just lost. And I kept thinking if I stayed, if I prayed hard enough, I could bring him back to himself. Some folks don't come back, Judson said finally. It ain't your fault when they don't. She walked to the hearth and crouched to poke at the coals. It still feels like it is. The drawknife lay forgotten on the table. Judson stood and crossed to her. You kept those kids alive through winter, Keziah, that's what matters. She drew a shaky breath. I don't want to be a burden. You're not. He paused, then added, you patch my shirts better than I ever could. The stew tonight had taste, and Josie sang while she gathered kindling. Keziah let out a breath, not quite a laugh, but close. She stood, and for a moment they faced each other in the hush of the room. I don't know what to do with kindness anymore, she said. You don't have to do anything, Judson said. Just let it sit with you a while." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased. Later, Keziah sat outside on the stoop, a blanket wrapped around her. Judson joined her without a word, a tin cup in his hands. The stars were thick overhead, spilling across the sky like spilled salt. He took a sip, then offered her the cup. She drank and handed it back, their fingers brushing. "I was thinking," he said, voice low, "come summer I could build a second room onto the cabin, give the children space of their own." She looked over at him, eyes unreadable. "That's a great deal of work." "Not too much. I'd like to, if you're staying." Keziah watched the stars a moment longer. Then, without looking at him, she said, "I'd like that." No other words passed between them, but he stayed beside her till the stars dipped low and the fire inside had burned to ash. By mid-May, the river had swollen with meltwater, and green spread slow across the flats below the hills. The twins took to running barefoot through the damp grass behind the cabin, their laughter echoing like birdsong. Keziah had finished weaving her basket, now hanging by the door, already half full with early shoots of wild onion and tender fiddleheads. Judson had started waking earlier, before the frost lifted, to clear the new plot behind the lean-to. He set fence posts by hand, each one measured by eye. The soil was stubborn, but he worked it without complaint, sleeves rolled, back bent. One morning, while Keziah was rinsing linens in the shallows, he brought her a handful of seeds wrapped in an oilskin scrap. "Squash and beans," he said. "Traded for 'em last year. Meant to plant but never did." She took them carefully. "You think the ground's ready. If anyone can bring it to life, you can." She met his eyes, then looked back to the water. "I never had land of my own, never stayed one place long enough. You could now." Keziah stood, hands dripping. "It's strange, isn't it? How quiet things get when you stop running." Judson nodded. "Quiet's not always bad." "No," she said, "not always." That evening, as she shelled peas by lanternlight, Judson brought in a bundle of pine he'd split and set it near the hearth. He crouched beside the stove, checking the damper, then tilted his head toward her. "You ever think about teaching?" She raised a brow. "Teaching? Jonah's curious about every tool I own. Josie's always humming something new. They've got sharp minds." "You could guide him." She looked down at the peas. "I never finished school myself." "Doesn't mean you don't have something worth passing on." She was quiet a long moment. "I'd like that," she said softly, "to teach them, not just how to read or sew, but how to stay still long enough to grow something." Judson leaned back on his heels. "That's more than most folks ever learn." Later, after the children had been tucked beneath their quilt, Keziah stepped out into the dark. Judson was already on the porch, sharpening a hoe by lanternlight. "Moon's near full," she said, drawing her shawl tighter. He set the tool aside. "You ever think about staying come winter?" She looked out at the trees, their leaves just starting to unfurl. "I used to think I had to move to survive, keep ahead of things. But maybe I was just circling." Judson nodded. "Takes time to know where you belong." "I don't want to be beholden," she said. "Not to you, not to anyone." "You're not," he said. "You're choosing." Keziah stepped closer. "And if I chose to stay," he met her gaze without flinching, "then I'd be proud to call you mine." The wind picked up. She didn't look away. "Not out of pity." "No," he said. "Out of respect. Out of knowing what it means to weather hard things and still look toward spring." Her eyes gleamed in the lantern glow. "I never imagined I'd be wanted for my stubbornness. I'd take it over silk and softness any day." She reached for his hand, hesitated, then let her fingers rest against his. "You're rougher than you look," Judson Vale. "And you're stronger than you know," Keziah Zeller. The lantern flickered between them, casting long shadows across the porch boards. In the hush that followed, she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move to shift her weight. The night deepened around them, quiet and certain. No declarations, no promises. Just two people who'd seen ruin and still chose to build. Together. By early June, the earth had softened enough for planting. Keziah knelt in the garden row behind the cabin, pressing seeds into warm soil with the pads of her fingers. She worked with a quiet rhythm, sleeves rolled to the elbows, skirt hem dark with dew. Josie sat a few paces off, stacking smooth stones into towers, her bare feet tucked beneath her. Judson stepped from the lean-to, holding a bucket of ash to mix with the compost. He watched Keziah's hands for a long moment before easing down beside her and helping to cover the rows. "You ever think about building something bigger?" she asked, not looking up. "You mean the cabin? I mean a life. Something that doesn't feel borrowed." Judson scratched his jaw. "I've thought about it more since you came." She pressed the dirt firm over the seeds. "I never expected to start over, not like this." "Neither did I," he said. "But I've come to believe the right kind of work finds you when you're ready for it." She sat back on her heels. "And what kind is this?" "The kind that takes patience, and choosing the same thing every morning." Later that week, a rider passed through with news from town. He stopped by just long enough to trade a sack of flour for a smoked ham and mentioned that the general store in Miles City had begun receiving shipments from back east again: cloth bolts, tin goods, paper, things hard to come by through winter. After he left, Keziah stood on the porch brushing dust from her skirt. "Wouldn't hurt to go in before summer's out." Judson leaned against the hitch rail. "It's a long ride. You think the children would manage?" "I'd rather not leave them behind." He studied her. "Then we take the wagon." "Make a trip of it." She glanced at him. "You'd go," he gave a small nod, "if you're asking." "I was," she said. They left 2 mornings later, Keziah driving the wagon while Judson rode alongside. The twins sat in back on a folded quilt, heads ducked beneath the canvas covering. The sky was wide and cloudless, the land open and gold with new grass. Near midday, they stopped to rest the horse and share dried pears from a cloth pouch. Keziah walked with Josie along the river's edge while Jonah skipped stones. Judson sat on a fallen log, watching them with a stillness that had nothing to do with weariness. When Keziah returned, she handed him a flat rock shaped like a heart. "Josie says it's lucky." Judson turned it in his palm. "Then I'll keep it." They reached Miles City by dusk the following day. The town was louder than Keziah remembered, full of rail men, drovers, and traders crowding the dusty main street. She kept close to the wagon, one hand on Josie's shoulder. Inside the general store, she eyed the bolts of calico with quiet hunger. The colors deep plum, moss green, faded rust seemed too bright against her skin. She ran her fingers over the fabric like it might vanish if touched too long. Judson stepped behind her. "Pick one. They're dear." "I've got coin for it." She hesitated. "Maybe just enough for a dress for Josie." "I want you to choose for yourself." She turned to look at him. "Why?" "Because you've had to make do long enough." She didn't speak, but her hand rested on the plum calico. He leaned in, voice low. "You've got a way of standing that makes the whole room quieter." Her breath caught. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything." Back at the wagon, Jonah held up a small tin whistle he'd been given by the storekeeper's wife. Keziah smiled at the sound, a high, warbling tune that made Josie laugh. They stayed the night in a small room above the livery, the 4 of them sharing 2 straw mattresses. Judson slept near the door, boots still close at hand. Keziah laid beside the twins, listening to the horses below stamp and settle. In the dark, her voice came soft. "You don't ask for much." Judson's reply came after a long moment. "I've never needed much." "What do you want, then?" He didn't answer right away. "Then, to build something that lasts." She turned her face toward the ceiling. "Me too." In the morning they set out early, the wagon heavier with supplies. The road was quiet, save for the hum of insects and the creak of the wheels. Keziah sat beside him on the bench, the calico folded in her lap. "Once we're back," she said, "I'd like to sew again, not for need, just for the doing of it." "I'd like that," he said. She looked over at him, the lines of his face softened by the rising sun. "I think about what we're making here. It feels like something good." "It is." She reached for his hand. "Then let's keep making it." He took her hand in his, calloused palm warm against her fingers. They rode on, the land opening wide before them and nothing ahead but room to grow. By the time the wheatgrass turned golden and the chokecherries ripened along the creek, the cabin had grown. Judson's hands, worn from hammer and saw, had shaped the new room board by board 2 narrow beds for the twins, a plank shelf for their books, and a small rocking chair that Keziah had sanded smooth herself. The door clicked shut with a soft latch, just enough privacy to let the children sleep while the grown ones talked low by the fire. One warm evening, Keziah stepped out with a basket looped over her arm, her fingers stained with berry juice. She found Judson near the edge of the new fence line, crouched by a crooked post, jaw tight with thought. She didn't speak until he stood. "Something wrong," he wiped his palms on his trousers. "Just thinking I might have mismeasured that west run. It leans more than I like." "Then we fix it," she said, setting the basket down. He looked at her, eyes steady. "You always say that like there's no such thing as too much work." "There isn't," she said. "Not when it's for something that matters." He stepped closer. "You've changed things." She raised an eyebrow. "The fence?" "No," he said. "Me." She held his gaze a long time. "You were never closed off, Judson, just quiet. There's a difference." "I used to think I didn't need anyone," he said. "That wanting more meant risking more. And now I know I'd rather risk it than go back to the quiet that comes from being alone." She nodded, slow and deliberate. "I used to lie awake listening for footsteps that never came. Now I fall asleep to the sound of a man breathing steady beside the fire. That's a kind of peace I never knew I needed." Judson reached for her hand, his fingers rough but careful. "You ever think about making it permanent?" She stilled. "You mean marriage?" "I mean whatever name it takes for you to feel like this land, this home, is yours as much as mine." She didn't answer right away. The wind stirred her hair, and the scent of dust and pine clung to the air. "My first vows were made out of fear," she said. "Fear of being left behind. I won't say yes again unless it's for hope." He stepped closer. "Then let it be for hope." She watched him, searching his face, and what she saw there was steady as a stone. "Yes," she said. The wedding was small and quiet. A preacher came up from the settlement, arriving with dust on his boots and a Bible tied in oilcloth. The twins picked wildflowers and wore them in their hair. Keziah wore her plum calico dress, the hem mended once already from where Josie had stepped on it with muddy feet. Judson didn't wear anything new, just a clean shirt and a trimmed beard. He stood beside her beneath the cottonwood by the creek, and when the preacher asked if he took her hand freely, he said yes without hesitation. Afterward, they all ate cornbread and dried apple pie. Jonah insisted on giving a toast, though he didn't know quite what a toast was. Everyone clapped anyway. That night, when the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Keziah sat beside Judson on the porch, her head resting against his shoulder. "You know," she said, "I never imagined ending up in Montana territory. I never imagined peace would look like this." He kissed her temple, slow and sure. "It wasn't the place. It was the right people." She laced her fingers through his. "I know what real is now. It's this." The stars wheeled overhead and the wind whispered through the tall grass. The night held no weight on their shoulders, only the warmth of a home built from patience, grit, and quiet love. Years later, the garden still grew behind the cabin. The twins learned to read and write and ran with calloused feet along the fence line. Keziah taught other children under the cottonwood tree in warmer months, her voice calm, her hands always busy. Judson built another shed, then a proper smokehouse. They never had much more than they needed. But they had each other, and the steady life they shaped with their own hands. They woke each morning beside warmth and slept each night beneath a roof they had earned. Nothing was perfect, but everything was theirs, and they were never alone again.